They locked her in a furnace, but she was not burned. They slashed her neck 3 times with a sword, but she still refused to die. The executioner, terrified by the one who defied the laws of physics, threw down his weapon and fled. For 3 days, Saint Cecilia lay there with her neck half severed, not screaming in pain, but still singing hymns of praise to God. This is the cruel truth behind the patron saint of music, a melody not emanating from a choir, but from a throat slowly bleeding. Why did Rome's most efficient killing machine fail so miserably in silencing a young girl? Cecilia was not an anonymous commoner pulled from the catacombs. She was a high-ranking member of the gens Cecilia, noble stock allied with the powerful Metellus lineage. In the rigid hierarchy of Rome, she was untouchable wealth. Yet secretly, she had converted to the outlawed sect of Christianity, and even more dangerously, had converted her husband Valerian and his brother Tiberius. They were using their substantial wealth to fund the burial of martyred Christians, a direct act of civil disobedience against the state. When her husband and brother-in-law were caught and executed, the spotlight turned to Cecilia. The prefect of Rome, Almachius, faced a crisis. Cecilia was too prominent to ignore, having publicly refused to offer sacrifice to Jupiter, but she was also too popular and too noble to drag into the public arena. Executing a Metellus in the Colosseum for the entertainment of the mob risked sparking riots among the aristocracy. Almachius needed her gone quietly, so he ordered that Cecilia be put to death within the confines of her own opulent bathhouse. It was intended to be a private, clean elimination that looked like a domestic tragedy, but it became anything but. The chosen method of execution was the caldarium, the hot steam room integral to any aristocratic Roman villa. The plan was simple: lock her inside and stoke the fires to unprecedented levels to cause death by suffocation and hyperthermia. This was not an impulsive decision, but a calculated use of domestic architecture turned into a weapon. The caldarium was designed for luxury, a place of cleansing and relaxation, but Almachius corrupted its purpose. He sought a death that would leave no marks of violence, a quiet elimination that could be explained away as a tragic accident involving a faulty furnace or a fainting spell. The execution relied on the ruthless mechanics of the Roman Hippocaust system. In a standard scenario, a furnace outside the building pushes hot gas under the suspended floor, acting as a thermal battery to radiate gentle warmth. But for this execution, standard regulation was abandoned. Almachius ordered the furnace stoked to its maximum capacity, far beyond human tolerance, and the vents sealed. The slaves assigned to the furnace worked in shifts, shoveling fuel into the firebox until the draft created a roaring intake of air. They were instructed to maintain this intensity without pause. The goal was to turn the stone room into a kiln. Inside the bathhouse, the vents that usually allowed excess heat and steam to escape were blocked. The heavy bronze or wooden doors were shut and sealed from the outside, likely caulked with pitch or clay to prevent any exchange of air. The room became a pressurized vessel. The temperature inside began to climb steadily. At first, it would have felt like a robust sauna. But as the hours passed and the thermal mass of the floor and walls reached saturation, the environment became lethal. The stone surfaces would have become too hot to touch. The air itself would have burned the lining of the nostrils and throat upon inhalation. Trapped in this environment, the physiology of death became horrific. The sensation transcended mere heat. As the external temperature in the caldarium surpassed Cecilia's internal temperature, her body's cooling systems would have gone into overdrive. The heart pumps furiously to move blood to the skin's surface, attempting to radiate heat away, but there is nowhere for the heat to go. The environment is hotter than the blood. This places immense strain on the cardiovascular system. The pulse races, and the victim begins to sweat profusely. However, in a sealed room where the temperature continues to rise, sweat does not evaporate efficiently. It merely drains fluids from the body. As the body's core temperature rises past 41 degrees Celsius, the sweating mechanism fails, blood pressure plummets, and the intense dry heat begins to desiccate the body from the outside in. The biological breakdown is systematic. At 42 degrees Celsius, the proteins in the cells begin to denature. They unravel and lose their function, similar to the white of an egg turning solid when boiled. This is irreversible damage. The brain swells, leading to confusion, convulsions, and eventually coma. The internal organs, the liver, kidneys, and gut, shut down as their cellular structures collapse. In the final stages, the blood thickens due to extreme fluid loss, becoming a sludge that the failing heart can no longer pump. The victim dies of cardiac arrest or total system failure. In a high-heat scenario like a stoked hypocaust, the physical changes to the corpse are distinct. In many fire deaths, victims are found in what forensic scientists call the pugilistic stance, a boxer-like pose caused by the muscles shrinking and contracting as they are literally cooked. Cecilia was locked in this stone oven for a full 24 hours, one day and one night, while the guards outside listened for screams or the pounding on the door. They heard nothing. The silence was more unnerving than screams. A dying person fights. They bang on the door. They scratch at the walls. They cry out for water. The guards, seasoned soldiers accustomed to the sounds of death, stood watch in the corridor. They could feel the heat radiating through the thick masonry. The door handles would have been hot to the touch. They knew the conditions inside were incompatible with life. They expected the silence to signify unconsciousness, the prelude to death. They waited for the full rotation of the sun, ensuring that the stone trap had done its work thoroughly. The intention was to retrieve a body that had succumbed to natural causes, a victim of an overheated bath. When the 24 hours were up, the soldiers cracked the seal on the door, prepared to recover a contorted, dehydrated corpse. The soldiers likely wrapped their hands in cloth to handle the iron fittings. As the door swung open, the pressure differential caused a rush of air. Instead, they were hit by a wall of superheated air, and through the steam, they saw Cecilia sitting comfortably on the bathing bench. The shock was absolute. The soldiers recoiled, shielding their faces from the blast of heat that rolled out of the room. Their eyes adjusted to the gloom, expecting to find a body curled on the floor, in the fetal position, skin blistered and red. According to the ancient Passio, she was not dead. She was not even sweating. The visual evidence contradicted everything they knew about the physical world. The room was hot enough to bake bread, and the marble bench should have seared her skin. Yet, the texts record that she sat upright, composed, with no signs of heat exhaustion, her skin pale and cool. There was no gasping for air, no frantic thirst. Instead, accounts claim that from within the steam, a sound emerged, not screaming, but a melody. To the terrified soldiers, it seemed she was calmly singing hymns of praise. This detail transforms the scene from a failed execution to a confrontation with the divine. The sound of a voice cutting through the heavy, stifling air of the furnace struck the soldiers with a profound fear. A victim of heat stroke is delirious or comatose. They do not sing. This was the moment the execution shifted from a political problem to supernatural terror. Almachius had intended to solve a nuisance. He had instead created a martyr who appeared immune to the elements. The soldiers retreated, refusing to touch her. They were trained to fight men, not forces that could suspend the laws of thermodynamics. Report was sent to Almachius immediately. The breakdown of the plan was total. A sword can be parried, an army can be outmaneuvered, but you cannot fight an enemy who does not burn. Scientifically, her survival was inexplicable. The thermodynamic reality of that room should have killed any biological organism within hours. For the Romans present, her survival was a terrifying display of magic that nullified the laws of nature. When word reached Prefect Almachius that the furnace had failed, his calculated plan dissolved into panic. The quiet domestic accident was gone, and he needed her dead immediately before word of the miracle spread. He ordered a speculator, a military executioner, to enter the house and finish the job with a sword. The executioner was a professional killer used to dispatching criminals who begged or fought. Instead, he was sent into a superheated room to face a noblewoman whom fire could not touch. He was not walking in to perform an execution. He was walking in to confront a ghost, and his nerve failed him. What followed was not a clean decapitation, but a frantic, butchered assault. The Roman executioner was not a torturer by trade. He was a soldier, a technician of death, trained to deliver a single, efficient blow to the gap between the vertebrae. This required a steady hand, a cooperative victim, and a predictable environment. The bathhouse provided none of these. The room was likely still radiating the oppressive dry heat of the furnace, the air thick with the smell of scorched stone. The executioner entered with a spatha or a gladius, weapons designed for combat, not for the surgical removal of a head. Upon seeing Cecilia, alive and unmarked by 24 hours of lethal heat, his professional detachment collapsed. A soldier trains to fight men, not anomalies. The physiological response to this terror was tremors in the hands and a spike in adrenaline that ruined fine motor control. He was no longer a state official performing a duty. He was a terrified man swinging a heavy bar of iron at something he believed to be supernatural. The first strike was a failure of mechanics. A proper decapitation requires the blade to strike the back of the neck at a precise angle, separating the atlas and axis vertebrae. The executioner, blinded by panic, swung wild. He did not aim. He lashed out. The blade missed the soft tissue of the spinal gap entirely. Forensic reconstruction suggests the steel slammed into the hard, dense bone of the shoulder blade or the lower jaw. The room did not echo with the wet slice of flesh, but with the sickening, dry crack of metal impacting structural bone. It was the sound of a clavicle shattering under blunt force. The kinetic energy of the blow didn't sever the head. It bludgeoned her entire frame, knocking her violently from the bench onto the stone floor. The executioner had turned a state-sanctioned killing into a street brawl. Panic overtook him completely. The target was now on the ground, likely writhing or curled in shock, making a clean strike impossible. He swung again at the bleeding woman. This second strike was arguably more horrific than the first. It bit deep into the muscle and sinew of the neck, shearing through the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Blood didn't just pool, it sprayed under arterial pressure, coating the executioner's sandals and the polished marble in a viscous red slick. As he raised his arm for the next blow, his footing gave way on the gore. He stumbled, his professional stance ruined, sliding in the very fluid he had just spilled. Yet, despite the massive soft tissue damage, the head remained attached. The structural integrity of the neck, the dense column of the cervical spine, had not been compromised. Desperate to end the ordeal, he put all his strength into a third blow. This was not a calculated strike. It was a frantic attempt to decapitate the victim through brute force alone. The blade sheared through the anterior of the neck, the front rather than the back. This is a critical distinction in the anatomy of her death. The sword sliced through the thyroid cartilage and severed the trachea and the esophagus. The physiological result was immediate silence. The vocal cords were disconnected from the lungs. Cecilia could no longer make a sound. Her body tried to breathe, but the air bypassed the mouth and nose, entering and exiting directly through the open wound in the neck. Instead of a scream, the room filled with a wet, hissing whistle, the terrifying sound of air being sucked directly into the trachea through the gash. The executioner raised the blade a fourth time, his arm trembling with a mix of adrenaline and superstitious dread, but he froze. Under Roman law, the strict ius gladi, an executioner was permitted only 3 blows to detach the head. To strike a fourth time was not an execution, it was butchery, and in the superstitious mind of a Roman soldier, it was to invite a divine curse. The earth itself seemed to be rejecting this death. Faced with a victim who had survived both fire and steel, his nerve broke. He threw down his weapon and fled the estate in abject terror, leaving the door open and abandoning his duty to escape the woman who simply refused to die. With the killer gone, the room fell into a heavy, terrifying silence. The immediate threat of violence had passed, leaving behind a solitude that was arguably worse. Cecilia was left alone with the wreckage of her own body for an impossible duration. 3 full days. The medical reality of those 72 hours was agonizing. The sword had sheared through the trachea, making speech biologically impossible. Every breath was a calculated struggle against drowning in her own fluids. However, the carotid arteries, the high-pressure vessels supplying the brain, remained intact. This meant she did not fade into a coma. She remained fully conscious, a prisoner in a failing body, aware of every sensation as her timeline measured out in hours. She lay immobilized in a coagulating pool of her own blood. Every tiny movement, a twitch of the finger, a shift of the hip, would have sent a shock wave of agony through the exposed nerve endings in her neck and risked reopening the partially clotted arteries. She was forced to remain statue still while alive. The forensic reality of those sounds was far more disturbing than the legends suggest. What witnesses reverently described as a wet singing was, medically speaking, stridor, the ghastly sound of turbulent airflow vibrating against the rough edges of severed cartilage. It was not a melody. It was the biological alarm of a drowning woman. With every inhalation, the torn tissues of the larynx vibrated, creating a rhythmic, gurgling rasp that echoed off the hard stone tiles. To the faithful, it sounded like a hymn. To a physician, it was the sound of a collapsing airway. Yet, in the terrifying silence, this gurgling vibration became a psychological weapon, proving that the executioner's blade had failed to silence her. The torture of dehydration was absolute. As the hours passed into days, the mucous membranes of her mouth and eyes dried out. Without the ability to swallow, her tongue would have swollen and stuck to the roof of her mouth. Her eyes, unable to produce enough tears to combat the dry heat of the room, would have felt like grit was under the lids. Yet she kept them open, fixing her gaze on the visitors. The skin would have lost its elasticity. The headache from low blood pressure would have been blinding, yet the cognitive function remained. She could see the changing light in the room as day turned to night and back to day. She could feel the stiffness setting into her muscles, the cramping of limbs that had remained in one position for too long to avoid jarring the neck. Despite this catastrophic injury, tradition holds that she remained conscious and communicative. This was not a passive waiting for death, it was an active campaign of will. The news of the botched execution spread like wildfire through the clandestine Christian community of Rome. Crowds of the faithful braved arrest to sneak into the villa to witness her final hours. They did not come to gawk at a corpse. They came to be in the presence of a living martyr. The visitors had to tread carefully, bringing linens and sponges, not to clean the wound, but to soak up the spilled blood as if it were liquid gold. In the Roman worldview, a condemned criminal was waste to be discarded. Here, the victim was being treated as a holy relic before she had even taken her last breath. They packed into the small space, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, listening to the wet rasp of her breathing, witnessing the impossibility of her survival. The atmosphere inside the villa during those 72 hours was a surreal blend of a wake and a revolution. The Roman guards, likely bribed or simply too terrified to interfere, stood at the perimeter while the Christian community filtered in. This was a capital crime in progress. Every person who entered that room and dipped a cloth in her blood was marking themselves as an accessory to treason. Yet they came in droves. The room, with its damp, cooling steam and the metallic reek of slow hemorrhage, became the epicenter of the Roman underground. Inside the villa, flickering oil lamps cast long, dancing shadows against the marble walls, illuminating the pale figure on the floor. Time seemed to suspend. The visitors watched the rise and fall of her chest with the intensity of reading an oracle. They were witnessing the slow dismantling of a human body, but the strengthening of a symbol. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rustle of robes and the stifled weeping of her servants. Cecilia, immobile and draining away, commanded more authority in her silence than Almachius did in his shouting. She was engaging in a final act of estate planning that was strictly illegal, transferring her property to the church under the nose of the state that intended to confiscate it. It was a silent coup performed by a dying woman using hand signals to outmaneuver the imperial bureaucracy. Lying in a growing pool of her own blood, unable to speak, Cecilia preached with her hands. The room was stripped of all verbal sermons. There were no grand speeches, no final words of wisdom, only the stark visual of a dying woman refusing to break. She used the only tools left to her. She turned her eyes to specific individuals in the crowd, locking gazes with them to convey urgency and peace. She used her fingers to point, to direct, to comfort. It was a performance of absolute control. When she moved her hand, the crowd fell silent. When she gestured toward the blood-soaked linens, she indicated that her sacrifice was a payment, a transaction for their faith. She converted the witnesses who had come to stare not through theology, but through the undeniable evidence of her endurance. A pagan Roman guard or a curious neighbor walking into that room would have expected screaming, begging, or the unconscious rattle of the dying. Instead, they found a woman who looked back at them with clarity. She directed the disposal of her immense wealth with a flick of her wrist. She indicated that her home should become a church with a gesture. Every movement required a massive expenditure of her dwindling energy reserves. Yet she continued to organize the future of her community while her own timeline measured in hours. As the end neared, knowing she was losing consciousness, she arranged her fingers in a final theological statement that became her icon. The loss of blood was now critical. Her vision would have been tunneling, the room growing dark, the cold seizing her extremities. The muscles in her hands would have been heavy, unresponsive, fighting the early stages of paralysis. Yet she forced her hand into a specific rigid shape. Biologically, a dying hand wants to claw shut. The tendons naturally contract into a fetal fist as the brain shuts down. Cecilia was fighting her own anatomy. Her fingers likely trembled violently as she forced the neurons to fire one last command: extend, do not curl. She did not just let her hand fall, she sculpted it. In the dim light of the oil lamps, the shadow of her hand was cast large against the bathhouse wall, 3 fingers and 1 thumb projected in silhouette. Even as her face faded into the gray pallor of death, that shadow remained sharp and defined, a final sermon written in darkness. On one hand, she extended 3 fingers, on the other, just 1. This was the final argument she could not speak. It was a silent, defiant proclamation of her belief in the Holy Trinity, 3 persons in one God, a direct negation of the Roman pantheon she had died refusing to worship. To the Romans, religion was a transaction with many gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the emperor himself. By holding up 1 finger, she denied the plural gods of the empire. By holding up 3, she affirmed the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It was an act of treason, performed by a dying hand. She was using her final ounce of metabolic energy to insult the state religion that had ordered her death. She held the pose as the last of her strength evaporated. The muscles locked in place, fueled by a rigor that set in even before death fully claimed her. As the metabolic energy failed, the chemical process of rigor mortis took over, calcifying her will into stone. The muscles stiffened instantly in that unnatural position, preserving the gesture not just for the moment, but for the grave. The witnesses watched as the rise and fall of her chest slowed, the wheezing from the neck wound quieted, and the light left her eyes. But the hands did not drop. They remained fixed in the air, a frozen statue of rebellion amidst the carnage. She died in that position 3 days after the first sword struck her neck. The immediate aftermath of her death reveals the intense, almost manic devotion of the early Christian community. When the executioner fled and the crowds entered, a chaotic scene ensued. In the mindset of the early church, the blood of a martyr was the most precious substance on earth, the seed of the church imbued with divine power. The witnesses did not just mourn, they scrambled to collect the physical evidence of her sacrifice. They used sponges, linen cloths, and even tore pieces of their own tunics to soak up the blood pooling around her severed neck on the bathhouse floor. These blood-soaked rags became instant relics, hidden away in the catacombs, prized far above gold. It was a visceral, bloody harvest that cemented her status immediately upon her death. Cecilia was buried in the catacomb of Calixtus, in a specific crypt reserved for the popes, an honor indicating the immense reverence in which she was held. Her house in Trastevere was almost immediately converted into a titular church, one of the first recognized sites of Christian worship in the city. For centuries, the story of Cecilia existed in the realm of hagiography, sacred biographies that historians often treat with skepticism. Her survival in the furnace and her 3-day sermon were dismissed by many as pious legends embellished over time. Cecilia's story could have ended there, fading into myth. But nearly 1,300 years later, history offered a shocking postscript. In 1599, during renovations of the Basilica of Santa Cecilia, Cardinal Paolo Emilio Sfondrati ordered the opening of her sealed sarcophagus. The church expected to find only dust and bones after more than a millennium. Instead, witnesses, including high-ranking clergy and secular officials, were silenced by the impossible. According to sworn statements, Cecilia lay perfectly preserved, a forensic time capsule from the 3rd century. She was not a skeleton. She appeared as if she had just fallen asleep, lying on her right side with her knees slightly drawn up. Her face was turned toward the ground in humility. Crucially, the witnesses clearly saw the deep, jagged wounds of the 3 sword strikes on her neck, and her hands were still frozen in the defiant 3-in-1 finger gesture. This was not just a miracle to the observers. It was crime scene evidence preserved for a millennium. The Pope immediately commissioned a young, ambitious sculptor named Stefano Maderno to document the find. Maderno's task was not to create an idealized piece of art. He was instructed to act essentially as a forensic photographer, to sculpt exactly what he saw in the tomb. The resulting statue, which still lies beneath the altar in her basilica today, is haunting in its realism. It does not show a triumphant saint. It shows a small woman, curled on the ground, face obscured, with a brutal gash carved deep into the marble neck. An inscription by Maderno reads, "Behold the body of the most holy Virgin Cecilia, whom I myself saw lying incorrupt in the tomb. I have made for you, in this marble, an image of that same saint, in the very same posture of body." The historical reality of Saint Cecilia is far removed from the gentle patroness of music often depicted in Renaissance paintings. The association with music came much later, likely from a misinterpretation of her wedding acts, where she supposedly sang in her heart to God while secular instruments played. But if she is the saint of music, it is a very specific kind of music. It is not the harmonious sound of a well-played lute. Cecilia's true music was the defiant sound she made while sitting in a furnace designed to incinerate her. It was the wheezing, gurgling testament she offered for 3 days through a severed windpipe, a sound of survival that history chose to remember as a song. Her story is a testament to a moment in history when the irresistible force of the Roman state met an immovable object of personal conviction. Almachius had fire, swords, and the law. Cecilia had a terrifying stubbornness that transcended physics and anatomy. In the end, the empire that tried to erase her quietly in her own bathroom has crumbled into ruin, but the church built over that bathroom still stands. In its basement, the remains of the Hippocaust are still visible, the stone furnace that failed to kill the noblewoman who would not burn. The stone furnace in Trastevere is cold now, but history is full of other fires, other secrets waiting to be unearthed. If you value this kind of in-depth research, where we strip away the myth to find the brutal human reality, please signal your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories survive the algorithm, just as they survived the centuries. We are currently combing through the archives for our next investigation. Who should be next? Is there another misunderstood figure, a royal tragedy, or a forgotten scandal you want us to examine with this level of forensic detail? Leave your suggestion in the comments below. Until then, keep questioning the official narrative.